Live every day as if it were the last, because before you know it, time goes past and life's just not that long. Tell all you love that you love them so, because even if you do, they might not know, and one day we'll all be gone. Taste the wind, don't let it blow on by. Sing songs of love, let the music get you high. And when it's said and done, you'll know the sun will shine.
I first moved to Albuquerque in June 1970, over 51 years ago. I strongly oppose all war by any nation. I refused to go to Vietnam to mass murder those people in the Vietnam War. So I was allowed to do 2 years of community service, first in Arizona and then here in Albuquerque. Some young people who may have damned war, hated war as much as I did, sadly did not know about doing community service instead of becoming U.S. soldiers to kill and to die. In the early 1970s, I met my dear friend Martina Tafoya, who lived here in Martina's town of Albuquerque. Martina enjoyed my taking her and her young nephew Johnny to the guitar mass many times at San Felipe Church in Old Town. I sang in the choir there in the 1970s. I drove my 61 Dodge, the only car I ever owned in my life. Martina said, "If I have anything to say to anybody, I tell them to their face." And that's usually a great way to live, instead of being two-faced. Martina told me to bring over to her home anyone my heart desired. She enjoyed preparing a meal for guests, even though it took a long time for her because she walked slow from her disability. And one day, when I was visiting Martina, 3 men came together into her home. And one of them lived right next door, and he worked at the city jail. And one of the other 2 men pulled out a gun on me. Now, I don't know if it was loaded, and I sure as hell did not want to find out. Apparently, these men thought that I, as a young white man, was somehow taking advantage of this Chicana older woman. The man with the gun took off my glasses. He took off my vest. He asked me, "Why are you acting so calm?" Well, I was not calm inside. I guess I was a good actor that day. Martina, my dear friend, became very nervous. I was her friend, and these men were harassing me, threatening me in her home. She threw down her sugar bowl. She went up to the wall and started pounding her head against the wall. She could have had a stroke. She could have had a heart attack on the spot. And finally, those three men left. I did not report this to the police because I did not want revenge from those men to be shot in my head or have a tire shot out from my car. For weeks afterward, when I came to pick Martina up, I parked on the street. I did not pull into her driveway, less chance of her next door neighbor man seeing me and giving me a hard time again. But one Sunday, I decided to drive in the driveway. And that was quicker because Martina walked slow, and driving in, I was close to her door. Her neighbor man, one of the three men who had threatened me months before, her neighbor man came out, and I feared what he was going to say or do. But he said to us, to Martina and me, when you go to Mass today, pray for me. It was his way of apologizing to Martina and me. And months later, when I ran for city council, and incidentally, I lost. I came in 9th out of 13 for that particular city council seat. And yes, I was disappointed at the time. But now, I'm glad I didn't get elected, because a lot of what city council does, I would have found boring. But anyway, when I ran in that election, I think it was in 1975, Martina told me that neighbor man had voted for me. And maybe that was the only time in the history of Albuquerque when someone running for city office received a vote from someone who had before been in a group harassing and threatening the person, and he later apologized. Saturday, February 5th at 12 noon in the South Broadway area, near the intersection of Edith and Cromwell Southeast. Edith and Cromwell Southeast. Saturday, February 5th, 12 noon. Join the family and friends of Valente Acosta Bustillos to remember Valente, who was unjustly killed by Albuquerque police on March 30th, 2020, going on 2 years ago. And we will unveil a permanent memorial to Valente there. It will be a reminder for our community of his life and our struggle for justice for victims of police terror. Valente Acosta Bustillos was a beloved father, a friend, a neighbor. He is loved by his large family of children, grandchildren, cousins, and more. Valente was there for his children when they were going through a hard time, and he could always cheer them up. He lived for decades in the South Broadway neighborhood. He was good friends with many of his neighbors. He was a hard worker who helped others around him. Valente was unjustly taken from his family, from his community, at the age of 52. Valente was killed when the APD officers who were supposed to be doing a welfare check shot him instead. Officers Bush and Sandoval have never been held accountable for this crime. And after the brutal murder of Valente, both officers were immediately returned to duty as if nothing had happened. And we demand that those two officers, Joseph Bush and Edgar Sandoval, be fired and charged with the murder of Valente. So, if you live here in Albuquerque, I urge you to come on Saturday, February 5th, 12 noon, to the South Broadway area, the intersection of Edith and Cromwell, southeast. Edith and Cromwell, southeast. And tonight, I'm reading more from the powerful book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, about how the U.S. government, mainly white people, stole the lands of Native Americans, how the U.S. government, mainly white people, mass murdered Native Americans. Many of the intensive genocidal campaigns against indigenous civilians took place during the administration of President Grant, 1869 to 1877. In 1866, 2 years before Grant was president, Congress had created 2 all-African American cavalry regiments that came to be called the Buffalo Soldiers. Some 4 million formerly enslaved Africans were free citizens in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, which actually took effect in January 1863. And the legislation was intended to have a demoralizing effect, but it gave belated official recognition to what was already fact. Many African Americans, especially young men, had freed themselves by fleeing slavery and joining the forces of the Union. And up to 1862, Africans had been barred from serving in their own capacity in the Army. And now the Union Army incorporated them, but at lower pay and in segregated units under white officers. The War Department, and see, back then, the government was a little more honest with the people. It was called the War Department. Now they use a soft euphemism, Department of Defense. The War Department created the Federal Bureau of Colored Troops, and 100,000 armed Africans served in the unit. Their courage and commitment made them the best and most effective fighters, although they had the highest mortality rate. At the end of the Civil War, 186,000 black soldiers had fought, and 38,000 had died in combat and from disease, a higher death toll than that of any individual state. The state with the highest casualty count was New York, with troops comprising mostly poor, white immigrant soldiers, largely Irish. And after the war, many black soldiers, like their poor white counterparts, remained in the Army and were assigned to segregated regiments sent west, get this, to crush indigenous resistance, to murder Native Americans, turning people of color, black, formerly enslaved human beings, against Native Americans. This reality strikes many as tragic, as if oppressed former slaves and indigenous peoples being subjected to genocidal warfare should magically be unified against their common enemy, the white man. That's what it would seem, but that is not what happened. In fact, this is precisely how colonialism in general and colonial warfare in particular work. It's not just in the United States, but rather a part of the tradition of European colonialism since the Roman legions. The British organized whole armies of ethnic troops in South and Southwestern Asia, the most famous being the Gurkhas from Nepal, who fought as recently as Margaret Thatcher's war against Argentina in 1983. In other words, divide and conquer. Put people who are the underdogs of different groups, different colors, against each other, while the big shots rule on top. The Buffalo Soldiers were such a specially organized colonial military unit. As Stanford L. Davis, a descendant of a Buffalo soldier, one of these black, formerly enslaved human beings sent to murder Native Americans, he writes, slaves and the black soldiers who couldn't read or write had no idea of the historical deprivations and the frequent genocidal intent of the U.S. government toward Native Americans. They didn't know the history. They didn't know the story. And so they became pawns and robots in the hands of the mostly white U.S. government. Free blacks, whether they could read and write, generally had no access to first-hand or second-hand, unbiased information on the relationship. Most whites who had access often didn't really give a damn about the situation. It was business as usual in the name of manifest destiny. In other words, the idea that somehow the God of the universe had made it okay for white invaders from Europe to take the whole of middle North America from coast to coast. That this was God's plan. What evil bullshit. Most Americans viewed the Indians as incorrigible, non-reformable savages, and those closest to the warring factions or who were threatened by it naturally wanted government protection at any cost. Many black men opted for Army service for survival reasons, as it gave them food, shelter, pay, and a pension, and even some glory. The United States had its own motives for assigning black troops to the West. Southerners and the Eastern population did not want thousands of armed black soldiers in their communities. There was also fear that if they demobilized, the labor market would be flooded. For U.S. authorities, it was a good way of getting rid of the black soldiers and the Indians. Let them kill each other. Talk about evil. The Civil War also set the template for the rapid Americanization of immigrants. Jewish immigrants fought on both sides in the Civil War, and as individuals, they earned a level of freedom from U.S. bigotry they had never experienced before. Indian scouts, Indian soldiers were essential to the Army as well, both as individuals and as nations making war on other indigenous nations. Many decades later, Native Americans have continued to volunteer in U.S. wars in percentages far beyond their population. Becoming slaves to the U.S. empire, the U.S. government that killed their ancestors, and being sent to murder other human beings in other nations. So sad. Wichita Nation citizen Stan Holder appeared in a 1974 documentary film on the Vietnam War, Hearts and Minds. And if you get a chance, I'm not sure if it's on the internet, it may well be, watch it. Hearts and Minds, in which he explained his volunteering for service, or I would say for slavery, where you can get killed and massacre other human beings. While growing up, this man had heard the older people's stories about Wichita warriors. And looking around, the only warriors he could identify were Marines. So he enlisted what he considered a warrior society. It's no accident that the U.S. Marine Corps evokes that image in angry young men. As with black men who volunteered in the Indian Wars and enlisted and served, or were enslaved, I say, in other wars, Native men seized the security and potential glory of the U.S. government's army. The explicit purpose of the Buffalo Soldiers and the Army of the West as a whole was to invade native lands and ethnically cleanse them for white settlement and business. As Native historian Jace Weaver has written, the Indian Wars were not fought by the blindingly white American cavalry of John Ford Western, but by African Americans and Irish and German immigrants. The haunting Bob Marley song, Buffalo Soldier, captures the colonial experience in the United States. And words from that song said he was a Buffalo soldier, win the war for America. Divide and conquer. One oppressed group against the other, while the mostly white government leaders stayed at the top. The Army of the West was a colonial army with all the problems of colonial armies and foreign occupation, principally being hated by the people living under occupation. It's no surprise that the U.S. military uses the term Indian country to refer to what it considers enemy territory, even today, in many other lands. And much as in the Vietnam War, the 1980s covert war in Central America, which killed hundreds of thousands of people in Central America, funded, engineered by the U.S. government, and the wars of the early 21st century in Muslim countries, counterinsurgent army volunteers in the late 19th century U.S. West had to rely heavily on intelligence from those native to the land, informers and scouts. And many of these were double agents, reporting back to their own people, having joined the U.S. Army for that purpose, to be double agents for their own people. While the indigenous Americans were being brutally colonized, eliminated, relocated, killed, the United States, from its beginning, was also pursuing overseas dominance, grabbing control of many other places, thinking God is on our side. Evil bullshit. Between 1798 and 1827, the United States intervened militarily 23 times. Were we taught this in school? From Cuba to Tripoli, which is in Libya, in Africa, to Greece. And there were 71 overseas interventions between 1831 and 1896 on all continents. And the United States dominated most of Latin America economically, some countries militarily. The 40 interventions and occupations between 1898 and 1919 were conducted with even more military firepower, but using the same methods and sometimes the same personnel. U.S. colonies established during 1898 to 1919 include Hawaii, formerly called the Sandwich Islands. The U.S. grabbed it. We want it. So get the hell out of the way if you oppose the U.S. taking control of your land. Alaska, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, the Marshall Islands, Northern Mariana, and most of these and dozens more islands depopulated in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and the Caribbean for military bases, U.S. military bases. Get the hell out so we can put a base here to control more people in the world, to rob them of their wealth and resources, and for bomb testing. And they remain colonies called territories and commonwealths, even now. And one of the first outspoken proponents of transoceanic imperialism, in other words, the U.S. going wherever it damn please across the ocean, was former abolitionist William H. Seward. So we can compliment him for being against slavery of black people, but certainly not for his attitude toward taking control of many other places and people. He was Lincoln's Secretary of State, and he considered it the destiny of the United States to dominate the Pacific Ocean. Seward did everything possible to fulfill this destiny, including arranging the purchase of Alaska in 1867. In early 1874, the United States began military control of Hawaii. And in 1898, it grabbed the islands after overthrowing the Queen there. And following post-World War II ascendancy to statehood, native Hawaiians and Alaskan natives were brought under similar U.S. colonial rule as Native Americans. Overseas venture gained increasingly exuberant public support in this country from mainly white people in the late 19th century. In the best-selling book, Our Country, 1885, the Reverend Josiah Strong of the American Home Missionary Society argued that the United States had inherited the mantle of Anglo-Saxonism and as a superior race had a divine responsibility to control the world, that God was telling the United States to take it all over. Talk about Adolf Hitler. By 1914, there were 6,000 U.S. Protestant missionaries in China, thousands of others in every other part of the non-European world, and they remained, as from the early 17th century, found in Native American communities. The United States built the naval Great White Fleet and expanded the Army from 25,000 to nearly 300,000 men by the time it invaded and occupied Cuba, undermining the ongoing independence movement against Spain there. And while U.S. troops were headed to Havana Harbor in 1898, Admiral George Dewey led the U.S. Navy to intervene in the Philippines, supposedly to assist a force of 30,000 native Filipino rebels who had won and declared their independence from Spain. But Dewey referred to the Filipinos as the Indians and vowed to enter the city of Manila and keep the Indians out. It took the United States 3 more years to crush the Filipino Indian, so-called, resistance to U.S. occupation. The Army, using counterinsurgency techniques practiced against the indigenous nations of the North American continent, including new forms of torture, such as waterboarding, and under many of the same Army commanders. 26 of the 30 U.S. generals in the Philippines had been officers in the so-called Indian Wars. Major General Nelson A. Miles, who had commanded the Army in campaigns against native peoples, was put in general command of the U.S. Army in the war in the Philippines. The continuity between invading and occupying sovereign indigenous nations here in order to achieve continental control in North America and employing the same tactics overseas to achieve global control is key to understanding the future of the United States in the world. The military provided that continuity. As a colonel in the 1870s, Nelson Miles had been in charge of pursuing every last Sioux Native American and herding them onto reservations guarded by U.S. troops or recently trained Indian police. The reservations were not safe havens for the imprisoned. Struck by the told of multiple horrors of daily life on the Yankton Sioux Reservation. And here's what he said. Another time when General Sully came up, he passed through the middle of our field, turned all his cattle and stock into our corn, destroyed the whole of it. The soldiers set fire to the prairie and burned up 4 of our lodges and all there was in them. The soldiers are very drunken, come to our place. They have arms and guns. They run after our women, fire into our houses and lodges. One soldier came along and wanted one of our young men to drink, but he would not. And he turned to go away, and that soldier shot at him. And before the soldiers came along, we had good health. But once the soldiers come along, they go to the women and want to sleep with them. And those native women, being hungry, will sleep with them in order to get something to eat, and will get a bad disease. And then the women, the Indian women, turn to their husbands and give them the bad disease. If you wonder why sometimes it takes me a little bit to find my place, this is a book from the public library, and so I didn't mark with a pencil or a pen in it. I urge you to check this book out of the library and at least read it, or at least browse it, to get the truth, the bloody, bloody history of this nation, of this government, this empire. As Vietnam veteran and author Michael Herr observed, we might as well say that Vietnam was where the Trail of Tears was headed all along, the turnaround point where it would touch and come back to form a containing perimeter. In other words, what began with the Trail of Tears of native people continued on to Vietnam, killing those people. Seminole Nation Vietnam veteran Evan Haney made the comparison in testifying at the Winter Soldiers investigations. The same massacres happened to the Indians. I got to know the Vietnamese people, and I learned they were just like us. I have grown up with racism all my life. When I was a child watching cowboys and Indians on TV, I would root for the cavalry, not the Indians. It was that bad. I was that far toward my own destruction. And this, the testimony from a Seminole Nation Vietnam War veteran. His eyes were opened to the hell that he was causing to people just like him, Vietnamese people. As it happened, the 5th anniversary of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam occurred at the time of the 1973 siege of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. And my mother and I, in the year of 1979, stopped briefly at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. It was difficult to miss the analogy between the 1890 Wounded Knee massacre and My Lai in Vietnam in 1968. Alongside the front page news and photographs of the Wounded Knee siege in 1973 that was taking place in real time were features with photos of the scene of mutilation and death at My Lai. Lieutenant William Rusty Calley was then serving his 20-year sentence under house arrest and luxurious officers' quarters at Fort Benning, Georgia, near his hometown. And yet, he remained a national hero who received hundreds of support letters every week, who was praised by some as a prisoner of war being held by the U.S. military. And sadly, one of Calley's most ardent defenders was Jimmy Carter, then governor of Georgia. And I wonder, I don't know the answer to this, if Jimmy Carter, in the years afterward, when he became president and in his many years since, has ever publicly renounced his support for Calley, who mass murdered people at My Lai in Vietnam. In 1974, President Richard Nixon would pardon Calley. And one of the documented acts among many that Calley committed and ordered others also to carry out at My Lai took place when he saw a baby crawling from a ditch filled with mutilated, bloody bodies. He picked the baby up by a leg, threw the infant back into the pit, and then shot the baby point blank. My Lai was one of thousands of such slaughters that the U.S. did routinely, deliberately in Vietnam, led by officers just like Calley, who a few weeks before My Lai had been observed throwing a stooped old man down a well and firing his automatic rifle down the shaft. Meditating on the 5 U.S. wars, major wars since World War II, in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and again in Iraq, there were 2 different major wars, one in 1991, the other in 2003, with flashes of historical memory of Jamestown, the Ohio Valley, and Wounded Knee, brings us to the real essence of U.S. history. A red thread of blood connects the first white settlement in North America with today and the future. Military historian John Grenier puts it, U.S. people are taught that their military culture does not approve or encourage targeting and killing civilians. They're taught this. But they know little or nothing about the nearly 3 centuries of warfare before the founding of the U.S. and ever since that reduced the native peoples of the continent to a few reservations by burning their towns, their fields, killing civilians, driving the refugees out step by step across the continent. Violence directed systematically against non-combatants, fathers, mothers, children, grandparents, from the start, has been a central part of Americans' way of war. It's nothing new. And it's still happening. The experience of generations of Native Americans in, on, and off reservation boarding schools run by the federal government or Christian missions contributed a lot to the family and social problems still found in Native communities. Generations of child abuse, including sexual abuse, from the founding of the first schools by missionaries in the 1830s, the federal government in 1875, until most were closed and the remaining ones reformed in the 1970s, traumatized these Native children as they became adults and their families. It goes on and on until it heals. In 2002, a coalition of Native groups started the Boarding School Healing Project, which documented through research and oral history the extensive abuses that go beyond individual casualties to disruption of Native life at every level. Son Elk was the first child from the very traditional Taos Pueblo here in New Mexico to attend the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, spending 7 years there beginning in 1883. And after a harsh re-entry into the Taos Pueblo society, he told his story, and here it is. They told us that Indian ways were bad. They said we must get civilized. I remember that word too. It means be like the white man. I'm willing to be like the white man, but I did not believe Indians' ways were wrong. But they kept teaching us for 7 years. And the books told how bad the Indians had been to the white man, burning their towns, killing their women and children. But I had seen white men do that to Indians. We all wore white man's clothes, ate white man's food, went to white man's churches, and spoke white man's talk. And so after a while, we also began to say Indians were bad. We laughed at our own people and their blankets, their cooking pots, and sacred societies and dances. Powerful testimony. Corporal punishment, in other words, spanking, hitting the bodies of children, was not known in Native families. That's not the way to bring up a child, any child. But spanking, hitting the bodies of these Native children was routine in the boarding schools. And often punishment was inflicted for being too Indian. The darker the child, the more often, the more severe the beating. The children were made to feel that it was criminal to be Indian. A woman whose mother experienced boarding school said this: "Probably my mother and her brothers and sisters were the first in our family to go to boarding school. And the stories she told were horrendous. There were beatings. There was a very young classmate, I don't know how old they were, probably preschool or grade school, who lost a hand in having to clean this machine that baked bread or cut dough or something, and having to kneel for hours on cold basement floors as punishment. He says, my mother lived with a rage all her life. And I think the fact that they were taken away so young was part of this rage and how the fallout was on us as a family. Punka historian Roger Buffalo Head said, "The idea of beating bodies for punishment, so foreign to traditional Indian cultures, became a way of life for those students returning from the educational experience. They spread this poison of beating children back in their home communities. What they learned in the boarding schools run by the whites. And yet you find by the 30s and 40s in most Native communities where large numbers of young people had in the previous years attended boarding schools, an increasing number of parents who used beating children, so that although you can't prove a direct connection, I think you can certainly see that boarding school experiences where beating children was the name of the game had their impact on the next generations of Native people. Sexual abuse of both girls and boys was also rampant. One woman remembers we had many different teachers during those years. Some got the girls pregnant and had to leave. One teacher would put his arms around and fondle this girl, sometimes taking her on his lap. When I got there, Mr. M put his arm around me and rubbed my arm all the way down. He rubbed his face against mine. At one mission school, a priest was known for his sexual advances. Quote, anyway, I ended up beside him, the priest, and all of a sudden he started to feel my legs. I was getting really uncomfortable, and he started trying to put his hands in my pants. Nuns also participated in sexual abuse. A nun was sponge bathing me, she says, and proceeded to go a little too far with her sponge bathing. So I pushed her hand away. She held my legs apart while she strapped the insides of my thighs. I never stopped her again. Much documentation and testimony attest to the never-ending resistance by children in boarding schools. Running away was the most common way to resist. Get the hell out of this place. But there were also acts of non-participation, sabotage, secretly speaking their languages and practicing ceremonies. And this surely accounts for their survival. But the damage is nearly beyond our imagination. Mohawk historian says, what is the legacy of colonialism, dispossession, disempowerment, disease inflicted by the white man, to be sure? Yet the enemy is in plain view: residential schools, racism, expropriation, extinguishment, warship, welfare. Indigenous women, in particular, have continued to bear the brunt of sexual violence, both within families and by settler predators. Incidents of rape on reservation has long been astronomical. The colonialist restrictions on Native policing authority on reservations, yet another legacy of the doctrine of discovery and the impairment of indigenous sovereignty, opened the door to perpetrators of sexual violence who knew there would be no consequences for their actions. Under the U.S. colonial system, jurisdiction for crimes committed on Native lands falls to federal and state authorities because Native justice can be applied only to reservation residents and then only for misdemeanors. 1 in 3 Native American women 1 in 3 has been raped or experienced attempted rape, and the rate of sexual assault on Native American women is more than twice the national average. In her book, The Militarization of Indian Country, activist and writer Winona LaDuke, and I heard her speak here in Albuquerque years ago, analyzes the continuing negative effects of the military on Native Americans, considering the consequences wrought on Native economy, land, future, people, especially Native combat veterans and their families, many of them suffering horrendous PTSD as their conscience awakens to the hell they caused and they lived in the military. Indigenous territories in New Mexico bristle with nuclear weapons storage, and Shoshone and Paiute territories in Nevada are scarred by decades of above-ground and underground nuclear weapons testing. The Navajo Nation and some New Mexico pueblos have experienced decades of uranium strip mining, the pollution of water, subsequent deadly health effects. Native American LaDuke writes, "I'm awed by the impact of the military on the world, the U.S. military, and on Native Americans. It is pervasive." Political scientist Cynthia Enlow, who specializes in U.S. foreign policy and the military, observes that U.S. culture has become even more militarized since the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. I absolutely damn the atrocities committed by white people and other people and the U.S. government against Native people for hundreds of years. White people, other people, the U.S. government stole many millions of acres of land, murdered hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Native people. And I want to say, I am deeply indebted to many people in my life who have taught me, who have loved me, who have inspired me. And apart from their wisdom, their love, their inspiration, I am no better than those white people who robbed and murdered Native people. All of us, human beings, are capable of terrifying violence and evil. And all of us, human beings, are capable of marvelous compassion and good. We can wake up, and with much help, we can turn from evil to good. We need the truth, the complete truth about the atrocities committed in this nation by this government. Good night.
Live every day as if it were the last, because before you know it, time goes past and life's just not that long. Tell all you love that you love them so, because even if you do, they might not know, and one day we'll all be